What's up, everybody? It's Chad. We're back again with another episode of Ask Chad Grassy Logic. Today, I got a cool ass guest for you guys. It's my friend Victoria, and she's from the Rudick Law Group. And you guys are located in Albuquerque, correct?
So we have a couple of different locations. My name
Okay.
is Victoria Cvitanovic. I act as of counsel for Rudick Law Group. We have offices in New York, New Orleans, in New Mexico, Louisiana, and also in New Jersey and Colombia.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you and welcome. We could always use law groups in the industry and everything. But before we get into the whole episode and everything, I want to thank you for joining and thank you everybody for watching. And thank you for Gino for doing the producing over here, or the voice of God. So appreciate you.
You're welcome.
As we move on with the episode, Victoria, please go ahead and give us an official introduction of yourself, since you're halfway there.
Sure. So once again, my name is Victoria. I actually started out working with cannabis and other substances as a prosecutor. I was a prosecutor focused on narcotics at first, then major crimes, and then leading a juvenile unit in a city in the South in America that was a liberal city in a really conservative state, and kind of wrestling with what that means. I think a lot of larger places in smaller states deal with that, where you're kind of trying to balance what's coming from the capital versus what's coming from people on the ground. In my government service, I became really disheartened with drug policy in America. I had been raised in this really conservative community that was really focused on following rules and doing what was right because the rules were what was right. And by the time that I had served for a little while, I'd come to the conclusion that drug prohibition was doing way more harm than any of these substances were doing in isolation.
Yeah.
We were piling harm on top instead of pulling it back and fixing it. So I left. I went into working for a really large corporate law firm focused on healthcare and technology. I worked for some of the largest technology companies in the world, helping to kind of figure out what it was. And I was left with this question. I had to answer it. Like, what was it about the flow of money through the healthcare system and private business that was creating this opportunity where, in one of the richest countries in the world, all of these people that I was seeing be prosecuted who should be patients weren't patients. The people that were in front of me when I was a prosecutor, they were sick largely, not some kind of like horrible person or criminal. And so I tried to use my transition out of criminal law as an opportunity to answer questions that I myself was left with. I ended up learning a lot about the healthcare system, about finance, and about how technological innovation interacts with that. And then I had my own accident. I took a fall at the gym and had a serious back injury, changed everything about my life. And despite trying to do all of the right things, all of the Western medicine things, despite being absolutely compliant as a patient and going to all of my appointments and doing physical therapy and all of that stuff, I was still in horrendous pain and I was still terribly depressed. A client of mine actually reached out to me and said, Victoria, you need to do psychedelic assisted therapy. You're hurting, you're in pain, and you don't have to be. And I laughed at her. I was like, absolutely not,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm coming out of being a prosecutor. I practice Buddhism and take, maintaining awareness very, very seriously. I don't even drink alcohol.
Yeah.
So the idea that I would do psychedelics sounded crazy.
Yeah.
But she actually called my priest and got him to talk to me. And he asked me a question that changed the course of my life. He said, are psychedelics for connection or are they for escapism? And all of a sudden, it's just like, I get it. No one in my life is showing up and being like, you know what you should do? You should totally get high and like not talk to me for several hours and be absent from your life. They wanted me around. They wanted me back. They were asking me to reconnect. So that was the bridge that got me over my hesitancy. I had my first treatment. And then all of a sudden, I remember kind of coming out of that first experience and holding my practitioner's hands and telling her, you have to let me look at your insurance. This can never go away. And I became a psychedelics lawyer there in that room, finding the holes in her insurance stack the same way I would for any other healthcare provider or any other corporation, and helping her plan and strategize. From there, the word spread. I started representing ketamine clinics and other regulated psychedelics practitioners, scientists in clinical trials. I started representing cannabis medicine first, and then cannabis in a more like adult use context came later. But it wasn't cannabis law that got me to psychedelics. It was psychedelics law that got me to cannabis. So I feel like
Interesting.
I've always come in with a little bit of a different perspective.
Yeah. No, and that's interesting because yeah, most people, that I know, and there's some who are actually in the same, same boat as you. They started on the psychedelic end and they found cannabis. But for the most part, from what I know, is cannabis then found, psychedelics later on once they felt a little more comfortable. And that's the case for me and for many other people too, because with the combat PTSD stuff from Iraq, I've dabbled with the psilocybin, and it's made a difference with me for sure. It's never going to be 100% fixed, but for some reason it feels like it teaches you. And I understand why it's called golden teacher. So but thank you for sharing your story with us, by the way, too, as well. I really appreciate that. It's never easy to share personal stories like that, but it gives more context of where you come from and what you bring to the table and everything. So I appreciate that. Is that when like your support of, I guess, drugs and psychedelics really started, was around the time of that, incident, I guess, or was it before then?
So I think when I left serving as a prosecutor, I
Mhm.
left with this idea that like I don't know what we should do, but it shouldn't be this,
Yeah,
right?
that's
So
fair.
I had started reading, I had started researching, but I
Mhm.
had also gotten a lot more sober in my own life. I had
Mhm.
stopped drinking alcohol to focus on my religious commitments, and I was kind of trying to figure out how to balance on one side, growing up in the South and growing up in this culture that was super anti anything that could be considered different, and then experiencing the harm caused by that culture and seeing it firsthand day after day after day.
Mhm.
And then also wrestling with my own relationship to what it meant to be a healthy person. And I think I carried those questions around for a really long time. And I didn't think anyone should be going to jail for this stuff, but I didn't really know what the alternative would look like. And I was going through this information gathering period. I was trying to learn everything that I could. And then all of a sudden, I became a patient. I went from someone who was like super healthy and at the gym all the time. People often laugh when they hear that my accident happened at an aerial silks gym.
Oh
Because it's
no.
like, yeah, because
Oh
it's like, it's
no.
that kind of, commitment to fitness
Yeah,
and that kind of like athleticism. All of a sudden, I didn't walk for months
yeah,
after my accident. And so that kind of made it click in my head that the only community any of us can join at any time is the disability community. Statistically speaking, most of us will live long enough to acquire a disability.
yeah,
And so that universal experience of disability made me start thinking in terms of my religion. Like, what is the most compassionate response given this reality?
yeah.
Well, my client who invited me to that psychedelic assisted therapy session showed me what the most compassionate response was. I did all of the Western medicine things and it still wasn't enough. She gave me another option that was safe and regulated and able to help me. She gave me another container in which to heal, and it worked for me. So all of a sudden, it went from, I don't know what the solution to this problem is, to I have to work right now to make these solutions that other people have figured out more accessible.
Yeah. That's dope. And yeah, I'm glad that, you had that realization because, some of the things you're telling me, I'm like, I haven't even thought of it that way too, especially about the disability thing. We're one accident away from, being disabled ourselves, be it whatever we're doing. Like I've had many accidents. So luckily it hasn't like, crippled me to the point where, I'm disabled, like even when in high school, I broke my tibia and my fibia, and that could have crippled me for life. But, luckily I was young and had a good doctor and they put a metal rod through my leg. And then they took it out a couple years later. And so, luckily we had that, or else, I could have lost my leg or something, and luckily they, nothing came with the skin, all that good stuff. So it's realizations like that really take you to another conclusion on things. And, you did that, and it's like a night and day switch, going from, because I grew up in a very conservative area in New Mexico too. And so like the things that you're telling me, I was like, oh yeah, I totally get it, because like it is wrong to be like different over there, and it is wrong to like do things that doesn't seem as normal. And these days it's a little different, especially with cannabis being legal and,
Right.
psilocybin becoming legal too. Things have shifted a little bit. And I'm finding out that more conservative people actually like cannabis than I thought. Yeah. But, the area I lived in, it was seen that way too. And so it's cool that, you came around yourself too, and naturally, and unfortunately it took, an incident for it to happen. But I think that's the same for all of us, because before Iraq, I had no opinion on cannabis, psilocybin, or anything really. I didn't know enough about it to really form one. But until I needed something and I didn't want to go to pills, did I really start to really, go to that journey and venture myself too. And it changed my perspective on everything as well too. And I was like, whoa, what do you mean the stuff that they give us up from the pharmacy and stuff like that is just chemicals put together, and there's, more natural remedies that we could use and everything? Like, that's crazy. And then you just have all these other revelations on it. So that's really cool and everything. So how long have you been, I guess, an advocate now, for cannabis? How long has it been since, you started this journey?
Yeah, so it's been a little over 6 years.
Okay.
And I've been integrating everything that came from my criminal experience. I left criminal law and was this advocate for criminal justice reform. I then got into healthcare and technology law and became this advocate for patients. Then I experienced healing from plant medicine myself, and it got added on to the other advocacy. I think I've been learning more and expanding the scope of what I want to advocate for as I've gotten the knowledge to be a good advocate.
Yeah.
One thing that truly changed my mind, that like helped me overcome all of the conditioning that I had that was making me scared to call myself a cannabis advocate or call myself a psychedelics advocate, was going back through the history and realizing that the reason any of these state level programs exist, the reason that there's any path to legally using cannabis in this nation, is because disabled people advocated for it. It was children having epileptic seizures on the stairs of Capitol buildings. It was AIDS patients there with the queer community saying, we're in pain and people won't treat us. It was this revolution of people who realized that in a society that often tells you that if you need more help, you're worth less, that you are somehow less valuable to society if you do not have a perfect body, even though most of us won't live our lives with a perfect body. These people understood that despite all of that stigma, they were powerful. And they had the ability to help people access these things that might make their lives better. Full stop. End of it. Recognizing that these people who were so beaten down by society and had been so neglected by traditional medicine and advocacy means cared enough to do this, that changed everything for me. I felt like I was obligated as someone who had experienced what it was like to acquire a disability to kind of join that great tradition of advocating for the next person who came behind me to have access to something that might make it better.
I couldn't agree with you more on that, because that's literally why I started this advocacy journey on cannabis to start with. I lost my sister to prescription pills, and I didn't want any other family to ever go through that again, especially a veteran family. And so I set out on this journey, and I said, I'm never going to do that to my family, and I don't want other people to go through that. So it's going to be my mission to make sure that we get that done. And so far, it's been pretty successful. We got the medical cannabis laws changed. We got legalization going. We got psilocybin, legalized last year, because I was, helping with that, pushing everything too. And, now, it's going so far as, low income people are going to get their psilocybin paid for here in New Mexico because of what was in the budget. And I think that's amazing, because that's still missing from the medical cannabis side of New Mexico. We'll get there one day. It's the damn stigma it has. Stupid stigma.
Yeah.
But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I think you're hitting on a really interesting point. That's a problem in cannabis medical markets, right?
Mhm.
There is this perception nationwide, depending on who you talk to, that cannabis medical markets exist because recreational markets are hard to access.
Mhm.
There's this belief that once these conservative states catch up and they launch their own recreational market, all of a sudden we're not going to need these medical markets anymore. These people are just using their medical condition to access cannabis.
Yeah.
And while there are probably some people who would switch over to recreational and not care, the fact of the matter is the people that the general public does not see, the people suffering with cancer or debilitating pain, the people who are suffering with end of life level pain,
Mhm.
the people who are not in line at your local dispensary, the people that are the reason that medical dispensaries in some states have to have a drive-through.
And that's
Those
why we
people,
fought for ours. Yes, for
yes,
sure.
yes, that's the person that's not going to convert over to recreational. And
100%.
so reminding our regulators that those people exist and deserve their medication in a dignified manner is going to be the thing that allows us to both have serious medical cannabis programs and thriving adult use markets.
100%. And you hit a very important thing there. In the early years of our medical cannabis program, we didn't have drive-throughs, and we were fighting for them for like 7 or 8 years before we got them, essentially. And so a couple of years ago, they tried to take them away. And so me and a couple other advocates, we went to Santa Fe and we had to talk to a couple of representatives. And pretty much the deciding vote was a representative from Silver City. Her name was Senator Hemphill. Great woman, lovely. She was an amazing representative. She's no longer, serving, but thank you for her time and her service. Her son is in a wheelchair, and we told her what was going on. And at first, she was going to, vote to take them away too. But we told her, medical patients are actually the reason why we installed these in the first place. But not everybody has a medical cannabis card, So there's, the person out there who, yeah, ADA ramps exist, but have you ever tried to roll yourself up one of those? Like, like even on a skateboard or something, it's not easy for someone to do that, especially if you're frail, or whatever. It's easier for you to stay in the vehicle and get your medicine and go home versus getting out. And who knows how long that takes for that person to get out of the vehicle in the first place and then get back in. Like this is something that's made for people like that and even parents, because you can't take a kid into a dispensary in New Mexico. So the drive-through is a little bit better of an option for them. And what if you get injured? Like I ripped my calf last year and it was a little hard for me to walk, but having a drive-through was really helpful, and delivery too. But you hit on some really good points there. And I had to say that, yeah, the drive-through thing was so important, especially for the people who aren't able to get into the stores, just as you and I who walk in there and everything right now.
Yeah, you're elaborating on something I think is really important for people to understand if they want to call themselves a cannabis advocate. I often hear advocates use the word accessibility, and they mean a really specific thing, right?
Yeah.
They mean like there's a dispensary available, or there's a doctor available, or whatever. But when we, as disability advocates, talk about accessibility, we often talk about the fact that accessibility for one person might mean exclusion for somebody else. So, like a
100%.
wheelchair ramp, for example, like an ADA compliant wheelchair ramp, might be perfectly fine as an accessibility option for someone who has use of both arms or a powered wheelchair and can get out of a vehicle, get up the ramp, and go in.
Mm-hmm.
But that ramp, if you're somebody who's using a cane or who's using a walker, another mobility device, might be the thing that stops you from being able to get in.
God forbid it's raining.
Exactly. So when we make something accessible for one population, we're often creating a solution that the general population will look at and say, look, it's accessible. But we're excluding a whole class of people that we haven't thought of because we haven't had an experience like them.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about accessibility in cannabis, we have to be talking about accessibility of all types. And that includes everything from drive-throughs and ramps to accessible lighting, touch pads for people who are experiencing issues with speaking, All of those things should be options for the dispensary owner who wants to put them in place. Likewise, financial accessibility is a huge part of this medicine. Here in New Mexico, like you mentioned, we did something really innovative with the Medical Psilocybin Act. The bill has always included, in all of its iterations, including the one that passed, the formation of an equity fund that says, look, Medicare, Medicaid, or private payer insurance is not going to cover psilocybin medicine. Now, psychedelic assisted therapy is much broader than Journey Day, and parts of that whole treatment model are typically covered by third-party payer contracts. But the actual medicine day, which takes hours of monitoring and often involves a lot of time that makes it expensive. It's not the medicine so much as it is the time if you want to have a supervised medical program. That's not going to be able to get covered very easily. So what are we going to do in a state where, depending on what source you're quoting, between 42 and 46% of people rely on Medicaid for all of their healthcare needs?
Yeah.
If that's our reality, are we creating a program for elites or are we creating a program for New Mexicans? And I think what we have seen happen in the past couple of weeks with getting this equity fund funded and getting this promise out there to the public that the state cares about these people is a realization that accessibility is much broader than a ramp, and that we here in New Mexico get it.
100%, and it's something that I've learned throughout the years myself as an advocate too, where I'm like, ADA compliant doesn't really mean much for everyone. There's only a certain group that works for. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad it's there.
Yeah.
It's there for a reason, and they fought really hard for that. Like the people who got that, they actually crawled up the steps at the Capitol Hill in DC to prove a point. Like, we can't get up here, and like, woo, it's hard to even talk about, because like, watch those people suffer like that. Holy shit. But like, they powered through that and they got up to the top, and they changed the laws. And we are here today. Now places have ramps and stuff like that. And now we have drive-throughs too for people, who also have, the disabilities and stuff like that can't go inside. So I've learned a lot too. Even lately, people who are deaf, like American Sign Language is so rare. Like,
Right.
I haven't met as many people that should probably know it. Gino's doing stuff inside and I have no clue what he's saying, and I wish I did. Oh, he's saying bullshit. I know that one. But that's something that I've noticed too. Like, on that extent too. I'm like, what about the people who have hard of hearing? Like, what are we doing for them? Like, are we having staff, maybe one person learning American Sign Language? Or are we doing simple stuff for the bud tenders so they can know? Like, what are we doing? And like, maybe we need to expand a little bit more too on that sense as well. And I think there's a really good topics, and maybe a couple people listening will have some realizations too, like, holy shit, like, we aren't doing enough.
Yeah. Cannabis advocacy is so cool because cannabis kind of gives us this opportunity. We're already stepping outside of what our society calls normal, right? So it gives us this opportunity to question, what else have we called normal that is really the perpetuation of discrimination?
Yeah.
What are we calling normal that's not good about our society that we still want to change? Cannabis advocates are innovators. Everyone who works in cannabis is an innovator. And I think it calls us to this really cool place where we can be flexible and we can question what we've been told and we can be excited about new solutions. We're seeing it happen here in New Mexico with medical psilocybin. We're seeing it happen here in New Mexico as people debate the future of the cannabis market. It's really cool how these substances that people kind of sometimes think aren't serious, or they think our jobs are like not as serious because they involve drugs. It's this opportunity to show how serious it really is.
Yeah, 100%. And like, I think we're doing a better job of I wouldn't say forcing them, but demanding them to take us more serious. We didn't do ourselves any favor by doing hidden Benjamins out of a pool noodle in the middle of Walmart, but that literally happened. Gino's laughing. I'm like, oh, that literally happened.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, there's a guy who was walking around Lowe's with a dab rig, and he begged them to kick him out, and they would not kick him out. Like, that stuff that doesn't really help us, but at the same time, like, we're doing a better job at being professional. and being taken serious as a real industry, not just on the medical side, but on the recreational side too as well. We're being taken more serious, and we're learning more too. We learn more about this plant every year. Like these different compounds, we didn't know anything about these 10 years ago, but now there's so many, and there's so many more that we're like, well, you know what, it's not all about THC. Like why were we so focused on just this one compound when there's so many amazing other compounds in here that can do so much more? And I'll actually get onto that topic a little bit later, because there's a study I want to talk about too. But I wanted to get onto to another topic here, and you and I kind of talked about this before too, and this has to go to regulations. When does trying to fix a problem become an issue when the government gets involved and there's too much that they're trying to do? I guess the best example is the way you and I met is we were at Santa Fe, and we were there to fight that labeling bill that they're trying to go through. And you mentioned something that I never even thought about. That I had such a great conversation with you, and I'm still having great conversations. And you create a framework for the illicit market when you do something like that. And I'll let you explain a little bit more.
Sure. So, as Chad mentioned, for everybody that's listening, we met when we were at the Roundhouse here in New Mexico to fight a bill that would have required people who sell licensed cannabis in the legal market here at the state level in New Mexico to have really specific recognizable packaging. All black, white text, small logos, specific label, whole thing. Making it very, very difficult for brands to distinguish themselves from one or the other, and for consumers to distinguish what it is that they're purchasing. Couple of problems with that. First, there was this advocacy around the idea that this packaging is somehow attractive to children, despite the fact that we haven't had enforcement actions around packaging that is supposedly attractive to children.
Yeah.
So that's confusing, right? You're telling a room full of operators that there are these bad actors on the shelves, but you're not naming them. You're not taking them down. How is someone supposed to know whether they're one of those bad actors or not? And how legitimate is it for government officials to stand up in a room full of regulators and say, this is bad packaging, when that person has never been able to correct course? More importantly, from a systemic perspective, in my opinion, is that New Mexico, like many other legal cannabis markets at the state level in the United States, is bordered by plenty of places where cannabis is harder to get, where it's either not legal or only accessible through very limited medical channels. We're a state where a lot of people drive through on the way to our attractions or other attractions. And there are a lot of people who are here for tourism purposes, and they're purchasing cannabis as tourists. Now, because we're in the United States, we deal with federalism. Federalism means that we recognize different levels of sovereignty, and that those separate sovereigns have separate areas in which they're allowed to regulate, right? So we have our federal laws. At the federal level, cannabis is a Schedule I substance. It is not legal to manufacture, sell, or possess. And then we have these state markets, where states under the 10th Amendment have decided that they're not going to enforce that federal prohibition in certain circumstances within their borders. Okay?
For my listeners, real quick, could you explain the 10th Amendment real fast? Because I'm sure there's a couple of rushing to their phones, and I don't want them to get distracted.
Yeah, so the 10th Amendment basically limits the powers of the federal government when it comes to the state. What it does is it keeps the federal government from ordering or forcing the states to enforce federal law within their borders. Because if you did that, if you made the states enforce federal law, then there is no such thing as state sovereignty, right? Anything that is not allotted to the federal government or another regulator is left to the states to regulate, and the states can't be forced to enforce federal regulations directly. So we have a cannabis market in the United States because of that state-federal separation of powers that we have happening. Well, as you can imagine, because there's 50 states, there are 50 different ways of thinking about how cannabis works within those borders, right? So when you travel, it's highly likely that you probably don't know all of the regulations around cannabis in that area. And if you come from somewhere else where it's done very differently, you might not know that you have to go to a specific location to
Mhm.
purchase legal cannabis within the state of New Mexico. You might not know what to look for to determine whether a location is a licensed dispensary versus something like a smoke shop.
Mhm.
You might not know how those procedures work. So, if you set really, really tight packaging rules that have a really distinctive look, right? Something that's maybe all black with white text on it. It's very easy for someone who's selling something like hemp or Blue Lotus or another mind-altering substance that's maybe either not regulated at the state level or not regulated at the federal level, maybe something that might be considered an analog under the Analog Act. It's very
Mhm.
easy to make that packaging look like legal cannabis. And it's very easy to confuse people who are coming in and out for whom this is not their passion
Mhm.
as to what it is that they're purchasing. I'm not saying that everyone who's selling analogs or hemp-based cannabinoids or anything like that are bad people. Plenty of people wouldn't do this, right? But it's not that hard to see how you would do it if you wanted to.
Mhm.
You also create a higher probability of inversion because you've made it very, very easy for out-of-state products to look like in-state products. And you've also created this psychological mechanism, right?
Mhm.
Where people look at a certain type of package and they assume that it's legal cannabis that's
Yeah.
been tested and regulated and all of those things. That kind of harm is deeply, deeply difficult to address once we've already got everyone changed over to this kind of packaging. The
Mhm.
amount of public education that you have to be continuously doing because tourists are always coming in to avoid people mistaking an unsafe product for a safe and tested one
Mhm.
is deeply scary. And when some bad actor does it and it goes wrong, who is it do we think is going to be the most hurt by that? The regulations that snap back and the public outcry that snaps back is going to be against cannabis producers
Yeah.
because that's what that product looked like.
Yeah, 100%. And thank you for mentioning that, because a lot of people weren't mentioning that, including myself and everything. But I didn't even think of a lot of those aspects of it. But you have a different point of view from the get go, of it all. And I've really appreciated that point of view. This whole conversation since I've met you, because that was such a great point. And the 10th Amendment part. I wish more people understood that. And kind of. I wouldn't say use it, but kind of look back at our amendments and what we do and can't do. But don't get me wrong, not everybody wants to read. So it's people like you and myself who are out here to inform people, because I'm actually working on a pamphlet to educate the customers that are from out of state, or the new patients, or the new users and everything. It has everything on there from contact information to the state, like poison control, CCD, DOH, to what size of a dab is it? What temperature of dabs do you take? What's THC? This and that. And so I feel that was something we were lacking here in New Mexico. And I feel and I hope that it fills a void, because I'm going to send this out to the operators for free. What I'm doing right now is I'm printing it out and I'm giving it to select people. And I want to get you one too. I'll send you the file
Nice.
to give you some notes on what needs to be added, where we can change it, where we can make it better. So that way, once it's done, I'm just going to email it out to whoever wants to use it. They print it out and give it to the customers. That way, we're educating the customers, and it also covers your ass too at the end of the day. Because it's a reminder in there to keep cannabis out of the hands of children. So that way we don't run into this whole packaging debacle thing that we ran into at the legislature, because that was their main thing, was what about the children?
Yeah.
When the real issue I saw is I went to Walmart, and after they said that their their wine didn't look like Fruit Loops, when I found a box that looked like Fruit Loops right after it, I was kind of like, well, what's the real truth then, man?
Yeah, marketing to children is absolutely a problem, or
Yeah.
creating packaging that looks like it's marketing to children is
Mhm.
absolutely a problem. However, the bigger problem that I see is that we have this entire kind of side of the intoxicating substances industry where people are operating in an unregulated or lightly regulated space.
Yeah.
They're selling things that might be considered analogs that might not be. They
Mhm.
maybe are selling like Kana, and maybe they have some alcohol products, maybe they don't. And they're not participating in this really strict kind of state level program market that most cannabis operators are.
Mhm.
And their products are easier to get. Their products are less expensive because all of the expenses that go with running a licensed operation aren't tied into the price of that final good, right?
Yeah.
And then we see poison control reports that say that this child took a whole bunch of THC and they were sick because of it. And we have no way of knowing whether or not that report means that a licensed cannabis seller who's selling child-proof sealed packaging to a responsible adult who showed their ID somehow had their product end up in the hands of a child, or if this is an HCC gummy that is going to show up on a standard urinalysis as THC.
Yeah.
Or if it's a hemp product like Delta 8 or Delta 9 that somebody got at a gas station. We have no way of distinguishing health outcomes like poison control calls from where the products in the legal cannabis market are actually ending up. And I think the general public hears 40 children called poison control about accidentally ingesting cannabis last month and thinks, oh my God, all of these dispensaries I see around are just letting kids get whatever. And that's not happening.
Yeah.
There's little to no evidence that licensed cannabis distributors are responsible for these issues. And yet they are the ones held responsible for them because they're registered with the state. They're easy to enforce against. They're easy to legislate about.
Yeah.
The harder targets, these kinds of what people sometimes refer to as the gray market of intoxicating substances products, much, much harder to regulate. And it's very hard to win political points by going after something that's that complicated.
100%. And you met my father too, who was a teacher for the longest time, and doing that creates a whole different level of issues. And they were just making assumptions like, oh, this would be easier for teachers to identify. And I'm like, I don't think you guys asked one teacher about this, because every teacher I've asked laughed at me before I even finished what the bill was about. They're like, oh, that's not going to work. Like before I was even done, they're like, that's a joke. That's not going to do shit. It'll just be annoying.
No, I mean, like, what child who is trying to sneak something like that in is going to leave it in the incredibly recognizable packaging?
Right, exactly.
It's a little, what I'm going to call well-intentioned, but not thought through at this point. Like, I think there are solutions for these things, and I think we can figure them out.
Yeah,
and I think we as an industry have to keep having these conversations with our regulators.
Mhm.
But I think we have to demand that our regulators answer some questions, like, how do we know that the problem that you're trying to address was actually caused by our industry?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I've seen the evidence to justify making it harder for operators and distributors to do business when we haven't actually shown that they're causing the problem.
100%, and I agree with you because I keep telling people, if they're not getting it from a dispensary, I get carded almost 3 times before I finish my transaction. Like my ID is just in my hand the whole time. Like it's ridiculous, yes. It's over-regulation, yes, but we can also say that that's definitely not coming from us. Like that kid got it from either the traditional market, gas station, or they got it from a family member. Because a lot of the times, from my dad's experience, kids that get alcohol or drugs usually get it from someone they know.
Yeah.
That's how I got a lot of the shit I got a hold of when I was younger. It wasn't from Walmart for sure. I didn't look old enough. But it's one of those things. And even then, you run into how accessible some of the stuff is when you go to Walmart. Like cannabis is behind a counter. I can't go in there and just grab everything I want, put it in a basket, I wish, and then just go to the counter and cash out. I have to tell them what I want, and they have to go either prepare it for me or go bring it to me. It's not the case for other substances, unfortunately. And I'm glad that it didn't pass, and thank you so much for that perspective of that side of things. And maybe because some regulators do watch the show, and so hopefully some will watch that and think, okay, maybe there's a different way we can go with this. Because I try to have a conversation with the superintendent of RLD afterwards, and he wasn't having it, didn't really want to have the conversation, because I kind of begged him. I was like, next time, please, talk with us. We'd love to work with you guys on something like this versus just fighting each other. And I kind of get the F you, F off kind of treatment, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, right? Being a regulator is a really hard job, and you're being told things from a whole lot of different angles. And I think it's difficult to be an expert on every single thing that is possibly going to affect a bill that you're proposing. However, what I do ask of regulators, if any are listening, is that when you are looking at cannabis or psychedelics or any kind of substance that alters the mind and maybe comes with stigma attached to it or to users of that substance, to slow down, recognize that you can feel any way that you want, but that you have to, as a virtue of your job, separate that from evidence, right? We are asking for evidence-based regulation as a cannabis industry here in New Mexico. And evidence-based regulation hasn't really been the discussion that we've seen around packaging and stuff like this at this point. We're hearing there's all this evidence that poison control calls are going up. Well, we also know that the hemp industry has exploded and that the minor cannabinoid industry has exploded and that the other mind-altering substances industries have exploded as well. Are we really sure? Have we seen the evidence that the cause of these changes in health outcomes is actually the licensed cannabis industry? And if it's not, should you be regulating someone else? I just want to see people produce the evidence necessary to show that limitations on our freedom are actually warranted by a coherent interest that is being served by the regulation that is being passed. That's it. I don't know anyone who's gone through the trouble of getting and staying licensed in cannabis who was like, yeah, I want to hurt people. That's absolutely why I produce these products. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
You have to care so much. It's so expensive and so time consuming and so difficult to operate responsibly that you have to care so much. Those people that are doing this responsibly are exactly the kind of people that should be involved in that conversation because they've already shown that they will jump through hoops. Not just can, but will jump through hoops to keep consumers safe.
Oh, 100%. And we do that all the time. There's so many regulations on the books that, it's almost overwhelming, but we try to make sure we follow every single one to ensure that, and there's been changes throughout it. Some people have made some mistakes and stuff like that. I think the Tyson ear gummy thing was, kind of a conversation for a while, the body part stuff and all that. Yeah, I know. One of my friends just sent me a picture of that too before the show. That's what popped in my mind. But yeah, I'm glad that it didn't pass, and hopefully, in the future we can come up with something a little bit better, and at some point I feel we need to deregulate certain aspects of the industry where we can cut the fat, because there's a lot of unnecessary things that we do, and I'm sure you experience it all the time with what you do and what you hear and everything in the industry you are in, that there's just too much BS that we don't really need to be doing, and it costs money, it costs time, it costs labor, the all around thing. Just doing BioTrack is like a job on its own, and it's like a qualification on its own too, so they created a whole industry around that when most of the stuff in there is very unnecessary. So I'm glad that that we have people like you fighting for us in that corner.
Well, and it's interesting, right? I have the privilege of talking to cannabis regulators a lot in my current job. And what I often see that confuses me is that we have such detailed regulatory structures around these programs, and then the actual regulators tasked with enforcing those things receive very little support to actually enforce them, right? So what we end up with is a market that it's extremely expensive to enter and stay into because compliance costs are really high. And then we have scattered, inconsistent, or sometimes non-existent enforcement of portions of those regulations. And that leads to this question of, can I, as a consumer, actually trust that what I'm purchasing from the legal market is safe when I know for a fact that we have a very complicated regulatory structure and very few resources allocated to enforce those regulations? If I read all of those regulations, it seems like I'm going to be getting the safest, cleanest, most amazing thing in the entire world. But we know, we've seen people on the floor of committee hearings at the Roundhouse say we have not filed any enforcement actions. So how does that work for consumer trust over the long run? The costs of these very expensive regulations get passed on to customers because they have to be. And to some degree, you're trusting that a customer is going to look at that legal stamp on the package and say, I'd rather buy legal weed. I'd rather buy licensed cannabis because I feel safer doing so, even though it's more expensive.
Yeah.
The years of heavy levels of regulation combined with low levels of enforcement start to make consumers question whether that additional cost is worthwhile. And I am very curious to see what cannabis markets look like 10 years from now, when all of these news stories about lack of enforcement have permeated in the public consciousness for long enough for people to really question whether paying $10 more or $2 more or whatever it is worthwhile.
No, 100%. And already with, the taxes rising here in New Mexico and in other states, that's just more reason for them to go back to the traditional market, or the black market, whatever people want to call it. And that just fuels that. We'll never get rid of the traditional market. It'll always be there. It'll just be very small, just like every traditional market. Even alcohol and tobacco have theirs. But it's just going to be tiny. But if we don't do something now, it's going to stay and get bigger and re-expand, because we're doing a good job of shrinking it right now. We actually are. But if we stay on the same path that we are with the taxes, with the overregulation and all this other stuff and the stigma and, the kind of going backwards with it, it's just going to re-expand back to where it was pre-legalization. And it's not going to be as profitable because we made it non-profitable, because of all the overregulation and all the overtaxation and all the other BS that we put into it for no reason, really. Just for fear.
I get wanting to keep people safe.
Yeah.
I think that's the main job of regulators who are looking at substances that people put in their bodies. And I respect that that's difficult. What I get concerned about is that, logically speaking, you have two things that would motivate a person not to purchase from the legacy market and go purchase from a licensed dispensary. You have lowering their personal risk of criminal liability for engaging in an out-of-market sale or transaction, whatever you want to call it. Then you have the safety of the actual product, right? We in this country are getting kind of divorced from the idea of the risk side of this. Yes, people do still get arrested for these things, but because it's not constantly in the media, and what is constantly in the media is the growth of these legal markets, the ability of that risk to be a persuader for the average consumer is becoming less effective over time. And what's been a lot more effective, actually, is saying, like, look, would you rather have something that's been tested for pesticides and mold and comes already in a child-safe package? Or would you rather have something that you have no idea where it came from or what's on it?
Yeah.
Do you really want to deal with that? The safety side has motivated people to inconvenience themselves and pay more and go to these licensed places. Now, the economy is very difficult for many Americans, and the expenses that come with a licensed product are still high. If we keep compliance costs high and keep enforcement low, then we are really at a point where I think customer trust in the idea that a licensed product is a safer product is going to decline. And I'm frightened for that.
Yeah, it's almost like, painting the tunnel on the wall and then telling everybody that there's a tunnel there and they just run full speed into it and, break their face.
Yeah, it takes one person to get smacked before nobody's going to run into it again.
Exactly. And then everyone's like, okay, that's not real. And we can't trust them, it's same thing, we're not building enough trust with it because, we have all this testing and stuff, but then, what are the things we're not testing for, and all this other stuff that comes up, and our testing kind of needs to catch up, but the regulations on it are kind of out of date too. And so it's kind of like, where are we at, because the consumer does want to do the right thing. The consumer does want to do it legally, but the consumer is going to do what the hell they want at the end of the day and get what they want at the end of the day. And so they're going to go with the means that they know best or that they can get to. And either that's the price point, the quality, or whatever it may be, they're going to go with what they want. And if we can create that whole safety net that what all their concerns are, then they wouldn't have to go to the traditional market. But we're not doing that, and that's unfortunate. And I hope we get to the point where we can. But it's people like you and I and other advocates, around the nation, that are going to be the ones that make sure that this happens. Because man, it's a fight out there for sure.
Right. I always tell people I want to see exactly the number of regulations that are going to be enforced. you know, whatever it is that we're going to allocate the actual resources to enforce and are going to be consistently enforced every time or as close to every time as we can possibly get. That's how much we should be regulated. If we as a society choose to have a super regulated cannabis market, great, enforce it. If we choose to have lighter regulations, but they carry more serious penalties or they require more frequent inspection, great, enforce it. We need to get to a point where we are only tasking our enforcement individuals, our regulators that are the government employees that aren't making the laws but are enforcing them, with doing what they actually can do and have the resources to meet. That's how you create a predictable, regulated industry.
100%. And I agree. And I think the legislators understood that too when that bill was
I
going
think
through.
so
They
too.
said several times, why haven't you guys enforced any of this yet? Why are you trying to create more laws that we don't even know if you're going to enforce because you're not even enforcing the ones that are currently on the books?
Right.
And those are really great points. The points that I didn't even make myself. I didn't have to, I guess, because they made it for us. And I was like, good points. And, that shows that, I think they're afraid of getting sued is I think the real issue is because they got sued once, with the plant count thing. And after that, they've been kind of, not wanting to get sued ever since. I'm like, dude, that's just the way things work though. Like to get this kind of cleared up and clarified and to figure out who does what, it has to go through the courts sometimes. And that's just the process it is, that's the way our country is built.
Yeah. And I do understand the point that was made. I want to make it clear that when the regulators were speaking back and saying, we haven't brought an enforcement action because we think that the language that we have currently in this regulation would be difficult to win an enforcement action on. I get that point. It's very expensive to litigate something. And as a government employee, speaking as a former government lawyer myself, you're always balancing, I'm spending taxpayer money to do this with how much public good can I accomplish with my budget. And so I understand looking at a regulation and going, this is kind of loose. It's not very specific. The looser something is, the more expensive it is to litigate, the longer it takes to litigate, the longer briefing has to be, and going, this might be a really expensive problem that maybe we can legislate instead of litigate. I get that perspective. On the other hand, I think that if we haven't engaged in any regulation based on the law that we have right now, we really can't legislate in an educated manner. If we don't know how a court's going to view this, if we don't know how it works, what we risk doing is creating more legislation that creates a ton of costs. Whenever costs are created, we often see lawsuits or other challenges. And now we have lawsuits and other challenges on legislation that resulted from not enforcing previous legislation. So we've just delayed the same court battle that was going to happen in the first place. I understand wanting to tighten it up and have the fight when you think that you've got all of the armor that you can possibly put on and you think you're in the best possible position. But I don't really think that adding all of those costs to the industry and then having the same fight later is fair to operators.
It ends up costing more, right?
Yeah, and it's complicated. If you are in the seat of somebody who's having to make those kinds of decisions, bringing this enforcement action could result in hundreds of thousands of dollars of litigation. That is an incredibly difficult position to be in. And it is fair to, as a regulator or an attorney, look at that and go, I don't know if this is good enough for us to win. However, that's not the industry's fault. And the industry shouldn't necessarily be tasked with spending all of this money to meet new conditions when we haven't even established that the problem that those new conditions are attempting to address was caused by the industry. It's just there's a gap in the logic here.
100%, and I agree, and I love the way that you put it, because I think a lot of us have the same thought process, but we have no way to put it to words. And now we have a way to formulate that now and kind of bring it to them and be like, okay, so you want us to do this, but you haven't even done this. And we get it. You don't want to spend money, but sometimes you have to step back and not look at things as just numbers. And I had to learn that myself when I was in the military. I had to stop looking at everything as a number. And I'm like, this is a specific, like individual or something like that. Like this isn't just a number. And when you look at it from that other perspective, then you're like, oh, and then the other things kind of click. Because if you would have looked at it from that perspective, okay, this isn't just a number, then we would have come to the conclusion, all right, in the end, we're going to actually end up spending more because we're going to create these other regulations. And then not only are we going to get sued for this regulation, we'll get sued for that regulation, and then we'll have to try to enforce this one. And then it's just going to come back to this weird area. And now your board is just full of scribbles. And so I love how you put all that. And thank you so much for pretty much breaking it down Barney style, because I love breaking things down Barney style to make everybody understand. Because a lot of people that watch, they're learning about how the government works. They're learning about how these processes are. Some people didn't really pay attention well in high school, but now they see it as a necessity. Gino's raising his hand, and people like you and myself, we're here to educate these people. So thank you so much. I had a hard time putting those to words myself, and I'm like, oh, thank God, that is the best way to put it. So
that's really kind of you.
Of course.
I think that we're in a position as people right now that are interacting with our government where we're starting to recognize that, look, we all have many, many similar goals. We disagree about how to accomplish them. This is not a whether question. It's a how question. Yeah. Obviously, the cannabis industry wants to protect children and use safe packaging. How we do that differs from person to person, market to market, and problem to problem. I think what all of us are asking of our regulators is regulate in an evidence-based way that shows me that the problem that you're addressing will actually be fixed by the regulations that you pass. And do not ask me to spend money in a very expensive industry with very small margins until you have proven, you have established to the best of your ability that the spend of that money will actually make people safer. I don't think anyone would hesitate to make a spend if they saw the evidence that it was going to impact consumers in a positive way. We haven't really seen that on a lot of these packaging bills, and I think that's what the industry is asking for. Most of us want to get to the same place, and so let's get there together.
100%, and thank you for that, and thank you for so much for sharing all of this and everything. And I just noticed we spent most of the episode on this, so I'll try to fast track through everything else after going through this. But we had such a great conversation. I didn't want to stop it, and you were just sharing so much great stuff for people to learn from that. I couldn't stop it. So thank you so much for all this information. And before we move on to the last topic or two, because I'm going to try to get through this next one really quickly because I do want to share that dispensary with everybody. Is there anything that you want to share about, your law firm and everything? I know we didn't like too deep of what you guys do, but I'd love to have you on another time and we can dig into that, and we can find out through time of knowing y'all what you guys do. And but anything you want to mention about the company you work for, or where to find you guys?
Yeah, so just a really quick blurb. Rudick Law Group, that's RUDICK Law Group. We are available online, on LinkedIn, and on Instagram. We are an all-female, all-plant medicine focused law firm. I run the psychedelics and the cybersecurity, data privacy, AI governance side of the house. The women that I work with also have large cannabis practices, trademark practices, real estate practices, mostly working with people who are at this intersection of plant medicine, technology, and highly regulated industries. We're working with people who are trying to do something different and are finding that regulations that exist as they currently do might not address their actual business problems. So we're the law firm that helps you answer questions that the regulators maybe haven't thought of yet and help you be ready to shape the future of your emerging industry.
Awesome. And thank you so much for that. That is something that we need in this industry for sure. So I appreciate you ladies so much. So I appreciate you being on, and thank everyone else from your law group for me too. And if any of you are out there curious about them, here's the information for you. I'll try to make sure we get it in the description, Gina. So that way you guys have all that information and good stuff. So I appreciate you so much, and I look forward to continuing this conversation. I know it's going to be a little bit long of an episode, but that's all right, y'all. We got some education stuff to get through, and we actually have a study to talk about real quick. But before we get to that, I want to talk about this one thing, and I wanted to talk about it while you're here because, I mean, as a lawyer, you're probably like, oh my God. So there's a dispensary here in New Mexico, and as we know, we're right next to Texas, and there's a lot of those dispensaries that are feet away from Texas, sometimes, less than a rock throw away. However, every single one of them, for the most part, gives you an option to stay in New Mexico if you so choose. So you don't have to go into Texas. You don't have to drive to Texas to get there. You can usually get there from a New Mexico spot. Now, Pure Life in Sunland Park decided to not do that. I'm only naming it because there's articles and stuff on it and everything. I'm not the only one reporting on this. So Pure Life down in Sunland Park, they went a little bit further than I thought anybody would.
Well, not as far as you think.
So the way they're shopping, and Gino, can you pull it up real quick to show everybody? All right, it's up. All right, cool. So if you guys look right here, County Club right there, or Country Club Road, that goes throughout Sunland Park for the most part. But this is the part of Sunland Park where it tips off and goes more towards Texas. So if you look in front of the dispensary, at the bottom of the screen right there is the dispensary and the parking lot, and everything is in New Mexico except for when you go into the road. So to get there and when you leave, you have to go into Texas. So this right here just sounds like a nightmare, not just for patients and customers, but also for the owners, because I've also found out that people that work there, they're getting harassed by the Border Patrol. Border Patrol was showing up and going into the shop and telling them they can be there, this and that, and they can question people in the parking lot because they saw them leave a dispensary, when that doesn't necessarily mean you're guilty of anything. You could have been using the bathroom. It just because I walked into a store doesn't mean I bought anything. And so I wanted to show everybody this, that be careful on certain areas of the state, because you run into stuff like this. And if you don't care, it's at your own discretion. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on this? I just kind of wanted to run through this, real quick and kind of get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so obviously this isn't legal advice, right? This is just me as a person commenting on a situation.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
One thing I have seen when it comes to people working in the cannabis industry is that the amount of risk that people are willing to take is extremely personal, right? Some people want to take a large amount of risk and attract attention on purpose because they want to point out that these laws are unjust, and that the fact that in some of this country you can legally purchase cannabis, at least legal at the state level, and in some of this country that you can't, that's unfair, and that it's a little bit ridiculous. And so it's not unusual for certain people within the industry to say, you know what, I'm going to challenge the consequences of the federalism stuff that we were talking about earlier. It is a little ridiculous that, you're a block away from a completely different governmental regime. And, God forbid you didn't have your GPS turned on and you didn't really know where you were or what was happening. It's very easy in this country to see how scattered, inconsistent, and sometimes contradictory regulations create problems for business owners and customers. If you're an operator and you decide that you want a high risk profile and that you want to go after attention in that way, that's your decision. I just hope that you understand the consequences that can come with it, and the consequences that can come with it for employees, customers, and other people who may be pulled into the risk that you are deliberately taking.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think it does a really good job of pointing out why the advocacy around cannabis isn't done. Obviously, it's funny to look at that map and see oh my goodness, it's right there. But beyond the joke, we need to talk about something really serious that's brought up by this.
Yeah.
People often think that the drug war on cannabis is over. The number of phone calls I received after the executive order requesting that the DEA consider moving cannabis to Schedule 3, where people thought cannabis was super legal now and the fight was over and we won and all of that, was just shocking. Cannabis is illegal to manufacture, produce, sell, or possess everywhere in this country on a federal level. We are still dealing with a Schedule 1 substance here, and people are still going to jail. Cannabis enforcement is used for a lot of other enforcement things. So, for example, if you are a person who has a previous cannabis conviction and you are arrested for something else, you might get a harsher punishment than what you did actually merits according to the criminal statutes, because of either former multiple billing or sentence enhancement, or informal, within discretion, consideration of the fact that you have a previous criminal charge. Cannabis criminalization is still affecting people everywhere. Like you said, Border Patrol is using it as an excuse to come in and interrogate people. There are consequences to the fact that even though we have these state markets, federal illegality is still real, and all of us who are participating in these markets are operating in open violation of federal law. We have to never forget the fact that we are here because the generations before us advocated for our access, and the job is not done. Everyone who stands in that parking lot and gets harassed by somebody because they went and purchased something that's illegal to purchase on one side of the street and legal to purchase on the other is evidence of the fact that we haven't finished yet. If you enjoy this plant, if you have a relationship with this plant, if you work in this industry, if you care about people, period, if you care about bodily autonomy, period, what you just saw on that map should motivate you to continue advocating for the undoing of the drug war, the restoration of people's rights, and freedom to use the substances that people want to access in a responsible manner in this country.
100%. And thank you for that. And that's another way to look at it too, because yeah, outside of the funniness of it and everything, and like, oh damn it, like people are going to get arrested. That is another way to look at it. That it's so ridiculous, because on the opposite side, literally of that street in town, there's a restaurant that is split between Texas and New Mexico. I think the bathroom is in Texas. They sell alcohol there. Not a big deal. No one cares, because those laws are vastly different. But you go just to the other side of town, and we run into this situation. And so we run into like, okay, like what are we doing here? And so, it shows us how arbitrary and how outdated a lot of our laws are. And, Texas has every right to enforce, the laws they have on the books, and we have, every right, and et cetera, and then the business guys. But I really hope positive comes from this and not negative. Yeah, that's all I hope for, aside from the jokes and everything. Because there's all kinds of memes and stuff that are going to come from this, I'm sure.
It's absolutely funny, right? In isolation is funny. But when we think about the circumstances that created that image, we really have to kind of get back down to our roots and go, cannabis activism in the United States was born out of a belief in bodily autonomy. Mm-hmm. People believed we should be more free to decide what it is that we put into our bodies, especially if we're sick and we need help. Yeah. That desire for bodily autonomy hasn't gone away. Mm-hmm. People still want to be free. And if you think we're done just because you can go to a dispensary and buy a joint, you're not paying attention. And I hope that every time somebody laughs at one of those memes that get made about this, they also remember that there's a very real possibility someone's leaving that parking lot and going to jail tonight for a plant that we all care about. Yeah,
I hope so too. And that's kind of it's like a dark comedy kind of thing, like it's funny, but the reality is someone is getting fucked essentially by the government, at some point. I hope it doesn't happen. I hope it hasn't happened yet. Other than the Border Patrol knowing, harassing them. But that's all we can hope. And let's hope that this can be used as an example later on of how ridiculous this all is. And I think Sunland Park will be a great example in general how ridiculous this is, because it's right next to Mexico too. It's the only borderplex in the nation, so it's a really great example of a lot of things.
I'm going to throw something out here for you to look up later and read about later. Let's not talk about this now, but we need to talk about it later. Look up the flipping municipalities work that's happening in places like New Jersey and New York. What's going on there is not only are there state markets, but there are exceptions in their state programs to allow municipalities to enhance regulations or refuse to allow cannabis or do all kinds of things. And so people who are interested in this kind of liberation are undertaking the task of flipping municipalities to being pro-cannabis. It's a great example of the fact that cannabis activism is not dead. We associate this with the 60s, but it's our generation too, and it's going to have to be until every single person who interacts with this plant is free to do so responsibly.
100%. And I've told this people. I told everybody this when we legalized cannabis. I said, "Congratulations, we legalized cannabis. Now the real fight begins." And even when we decriminalize it on the federal level, whatever, we're still going to be fighting regulations or whatever. It's always going to be something, but we're always going to have to be able to fight. And thank you so much for that reminder too. We're always going to have to be fighting, and the fight is far from over. We've made tons of progress. Don't get me wrong, leaps and bounds, but it's far from over. I don't even think we've met got to halftime yet. So yeah, we're not even there. But anyway, I appreciate your comments on that story and everything. I just wanted to bring it up. Thought it was a funny little story, and also some realization that comes to it too on how far we've come and how ridiculous some of the stuff is. So thank you for that. Now on my last topic. Now this one, I don't know how long it's going to take or whatever, but I did want to talk about, and I don't know if you saw it, there was a study that recently came out, and it says that cannabis isn't the best for when it comes to mental use disorders and stuff, or mental disorders and stuff like that, PTSD, blah, blah, blah. There was a couple of caveats, but I have a few issues myself for this study, and I'll give you mine, and of course you can give me yours if you know about it, and I'll read what it's about. I'm not going to go through the whole study because it's pages and pages, but I'll give it just what it is. So it was done by Lancet Psychiatry. And I believe they're out of, they're researchers out of South Wales University. So this wasn't done in the United States, it was done in another country. And Sydney, Australia, their health departments funded most of the studies and stuff like that too. And this is also, and this part is important, and people need to know this, like how they got their information. This is a meta-analysis, meaning no actual participants were a part of the study. All this information was compiled, and they took information from 1980 all the way to 2025. All these studies that they took were peer reviewed and everything like that. And I guess the study is peer reviewed as well too. But they took studies from then till now, but they only looked at CBD and THC, as well as majority of the product, which tells me that most of their data is actually a little more newer than they're making it seem, because they have a product that they use called Cvitanovic. Now, Cvitanovic was made by JW Pharmaceuticals in the early 2000s. So that tells me most of their data is compiled from the 2000s area, because this product is a one-to-one essentially product with CBD and THC in it. They claim there's minor cannabinoids in it and everything, but I really don't know. I don't have the test in front of me. And so the study is saying that they went through all these results and they came to the conclusion, and I'm sure AI was involved somewhere, that I know, right? That cannabis isn't the best use for, when it comes to PTSD. There was no change, et cetera, and stuff like that. But one thing that bothered me is they went and talked about with Tourette syndrome, right? And they said, we did, however, notice a difference of Tourette syndrome when CBD and THC were put together. And I was like, there you go. There's the issue right there. You guys are worried about one or two compounds, not the mix of all of them together, or even CBG, CBN, THCV, terpenes, volatile sulfurs, and stuff like that. Like, none of that is mentioned in any of these studies, and it's never been studied. And to be honest, in the 80s, we still barely knew what was in cannabis. So I mean, it's fair that the data they got back then was just THC, because that's really all we knew on cannabis. I mean, CBD is still fairly new to us as well. It's something that we're still in. We still find compounds all the time in cannabis that are discovered. So there's hundreds in there. So Cvitanovic is owned by, it was made by JW Pharmaceuticals, and now Jazz, which is a weird name to have for a pharmaceutical company. Jazz Pharmaceuticals in Dublin, Ireland is the one who owns it now. And so all this information was compiled from different areas. And I have a lot of issues with the way that the data was collected, and the fact that it's solely based on THC, because maybe THC isn't the best for PTSD, but maybe CBN is, or maybe CBG is, or maybe THCV is. We don't know yet because we haven't studied it. And so this right here is being, and I wanted to talk about it because it's all over the internet right now. It's like, oh, cannabis is bad for PTSD. But when you read the study, they said themselves that there's actually not enough information that they have in data to actually confirm that cannabis isn't good for PTSD. So it was a little misleading on the titles as well.
Why did they publish it if they didn't have any of the information?
I don't know. And it was peer reviewed on top of it. So like someone else, a bunch of other people read this.
Well, those
and said,
peers must have been high then, because
something.
I don't know.
And one thing I noticed too, and we talked about this earlier, is you have to look away from just the numbers. And one thing I learned about when I was, military intelligence is we didn't look at just numbers. We looked at what we were told, the words we were told. We were looked at, other data and information. And I feel that this right here only relied on one data set, and that was numbers that came from results that they didn't get themselves, because they don't know how all these experiments are really done. I mean, they can look at it, but they don't really know exactly what the data was being given to these people and how accurate it was. So with all that pretty much being said, what is your thoughts on this study?
So I actually read this today before I came onto the show, and it reminded me of a problem that's happening in psilocybin right now. you may have seen an article in Lucid News a couple of weeks ago that I was quoted in, where we were talking about the fact that despite the fact that many state programs are focused on granting access to psilocybin therapy to people with a PTSD diagnosis, there is actually very little hard data on what psilocybin journeying does for people with PTSD. We have lots of anecdotal evidence, but we have very little scientific data that establishes that there's a positive result for the average person with PTSD.
Yeah.
Now, I was having a conversation with a scientist when we were putting this article together, and she asked me, she was like, why are people so focused on this when it comes to political activism? Is it because there's the veteran support around PTSD? What is it? And what I said to her was, we have to remember as a group of people, as a society around the world, that every bit of information that we have that's even relatively recent on these substances came out of a prohibition environment. We have the UN treaties on narcotics. We have very similar, although not the same, national laws around the world on the limitation of access to research of and use of these substances. So the information that we have right now is reflective of our regulatory environment. So problem number one with studies like this is that they necessarily take place in a regulatory environment that has artificially restricted the accessibility, availability, and even existence of data. And people have to start reading any study about any prohibited substance with the assumption that the data that we have is to some degree artificial, because we have limited access so much. On top of that, we have the problem of scientific reporting, right? Scientific reporting is essential to people gathering political will and making changes and moving forward as a society. But it's very difficult to report on a process that makes incremental changes and achievements in a way that's exciting and gathers clicks. Science is important because it's rigorous, right? But what attracts people to click on a headline is excitement. And we know for a fact that about 60% more clicks go to headlines that are negative. Headlines that say things like, this doesn't help, are so much more likely to get clicks than ones that say this does help, or this does nothing, or we don't know. Negativity bias and attention bias resulting from negativity motivates a lot about the way that science is reported. And so we have this artificial limitation on data environment. And then we have this artificial limitation on attention and reporting and money environment, all of which is skewing what we're looking at. So if you read this study and you were like, I have problems with the way that this was collected, this doesn't seem right. Like, this doesn't seem to tell the whole story. I think the best thing that you can do as an average person is start advocating for more access. Schedule 1 in the United States is defined as something that has no known medical use and a high potential for abuse. How do we know that something has no known medical use if we're not able to freely study it? It's
like Supreme
very
Court's
difficult.
arguments,
Yes, it's very difficult for us to have real hard scientific data on something we've already decided is useless. So if you read these studies, if you see reporting and you're like, that doesn't line up with my experience at all, this makes absolutely no sense, put your advocacy hat back on. We are not done. And we talk about bodily autonomy as being like the reason that we fight for liberalization around the prohibitions on drugs in this society, but it's just as important for science, and it's just as important for medicine. Part of our bodily autonomy is the ability to use our brains freely and study what it is that we want to do. And right now, every single piece of information that we get about prohibited substances comes from that artificially limited prohibitionist environment.
100%, because I want to add that, Australia in the last 4 years has approved 1 million like prescriptions, like they've approved different, prescription drugs, and CBD and, cannabis is kind of, tripling as well too, and, and people getting prescribed it. So what it is it's like what's happening here. The pharmaceutical companies over there are starting to see cannabis kind of chip into their investment. So to me, it seems like they kind of helped fund a lot of this stuff because you have a lot of Australian health organizations that are involved in this study and stuff like that. And the way that it was collected is kind of like, it seems like it was attacked the whole time, like just the way that it's laid out. And I'm like, this just doesn't seem right. And so I'm glad that, you bring that up. And yeah, we do need to advocate because being Schedule 1, we can't study it, like these other countries can. That's why this study came from Australia and they used, a Dublin, Ireland product and stuff like that. And, it's all over the place because we can't do that here in our country. It's like, yeah, there's studies here that, certain states have done, but the federal government doesn't recognize those, they have to have these federally approved things and stuff like that. So,
and we do have federal programs that study Schedule 1 drugs, but they're very limited and they're very expensive.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that in and of itself is a problem, right? We have created an environment where the only people that can get access to studying these kinds of things are usually corporate interests that may have, a book of business on one side and may have scientific interests on the other. And how that shakes out really depends on the company.
Bright Green, you heard about them?
I like the chuckle.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's always going to be complicated. Studying a botanical in and of itself, like a botanical product under the current FDA structure for getting something approved as a drug that would fit under Schedule 3, that is incredibly complicated. Think about just the number of compounds we already know about that exist in cannabis flower. It is going to be incredibly, incredibly difficult if we ever get to Schedule 3 to make a botanical product fit into that. We've created a regulatory environment that assumes a whole bunch of things, like safety is the single most important priority, personal responsibility doesn't matter, and scientific advancement comes second to prohibition. And we as a society have the ability to change that regulatory environment. Whenever I see things like this, I think about going to the Normal conference in Florida and standing around these lawyers in their 80s and 90s who had fought huge, huge cases where their clients were facing life in prison for cannabis, and how sad they were when they said, people your age, Victoria, act like this is done. They act like we've already won. We haven't. So many people who could benefit from this stuff are not getting what it is that we already have the ability to give them because of our regulatory environment. And it's the voters, the regulators, and the people who care that are listening to this podcast that have the ability to get mad and change it.
100%. And I tell people, don't get mad at each other, get mad at the right people, because, they want us mad at each other and, they want us to fight each other because nothing gets done. And the moment we finally realize that and we get mad at the right people, I think, things will change for the better. But it's going to take us reminding people constantly that too. So I thank you so much for reminding everyone and for your comments and joining me on the show today. It's been a very enlightening conversation, and you have such a wealth of information to share with us too as well, and a different perspective. Just starting out, being the prosecutor point of view, it's a game changer for us because we don't have that point of view in cannabis for the most of the time. So having that point of view and then able to kind of come to the other side and have the other point of view too, it's valuable. So I thank you so much. And I look forward to what you do in the state and to help you out wherever I can. So let me know. And I look forward to have you back on the show again. So is there anything else you want to talk about or mention before we end the episode today?
I'll just end with this. For anyone who's listening, I hope that I'm proof to you that you can change your mind and that there's not a such thing as sides. It's very easy in this industry to get mad at law enforcement or regulators or this person or that person. The fact of the matter is most people think that they're working towards a better world. And most people think that what they're doing is contributing to the reduction of suffering and a better life for other people. Sometimes we learn new information that lets us know that what we were doing in the past wasn't the best way and that we're allowed to change our minds. I have done it very publicly. And if there's something that you're holding on to that is keeping you from being the best advocate, best person that you can be, and you're not sure if you can change it, I just want to promise you that you can and that all of us are working together. There is no such thing as other people. We are all in this one earth together.
Better together. I appreciate that. And thank you for those kind words. And thank you so much again for being on this wonderful episode. It's a little bit longer than usual, but I think there's a bunch of great information that people can, take back with them and everything. So I appreciate it. I'll let you get back to your doggies.
Thanks, everybody.
The voice of dog.
All right, guys. We'll see you next week for the next episode of #Grassy Logic. All right, y'all. Shoot.